Monterey Public Library welcomes you to this afternoon's Cannery Row Days program. We do give our thanks to our sponsors, the City of Monterey, Cannery Row Company, Cannery Row Foundation, and the Western Flyer Foundation. I am pleased to welcome Emily Gottlieb, who is the Education Director for the Western Flyer Foundation. Thank you, Emily, for being here today.
Thank you, Francesca, and thanks again to the Monterey Public Library for hosting this event. So today we will be watching a silent film, which will show footage inside Hovden Cannery from 1943. The film will run about 20 minutes long. The film is going to be introduced by two historians. We've got with us today Tim Thomas, a local fisheries historian, and Kim Gudmundson. Kim was a graduate from the Masters of Liberal Arts program at Stanford, and Kim wrote her thesis on Cannery Women of Cannery Row. There are 2 copies of her thesis in circulation at the Monterey Public Library, which you can check out. So I'm going to pass this over to Tim and Kim now. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Emily. Welcome, everyone. Today, first, I want to apologize for not being able to show you Clash by Night, which is a wonderful film. I highly recommend it. If you get a chance to go and rent it, you can find it on YouTube and Amazon and those kind of places. And sometimes the Turner Classic Network shows it periodically. But I do have a little story about it. I have a friend, a man named Frank Tanaka. And Frank Tanaka worked in one of the canneries that they filmed that movie in. He worked up in the boxing room. And he told me whenever they're making the movie, he'd take a big wrench and jam the machinery so the boxes wouldn't come down. So they all go down and look at Marilyn Monroe. So I highly recommend the film if you get a chance to see it. So not that we can replace Marilyn Monroe and Barbara Stanwyck, but we are going to show this film that inside the Hovden Cannery film. There isn't really a title to it. Let me give you a little background on the film. The film was shot in 1943 by the Hovden Cannery, and the idea of the film, the purpose of making the film was to take to show off their cannery. Hovden was very proud of what they did there, and they would take that film to trade shows and to world fairs and things like that, and they would show the film. And in my view, this film is probably the best document that exists that shows how these canneries actually operated. And I had the privilege of actually collecting the master print of this film that belonged to Newt Hovden himself. And it's actually in color. The actual initial film is beautiful, bright color. Unfortunately, we're not being able to show you the color version today, but the film itself was shot in color, and and it sat in Mr. Hovden's safe for many, many years. He left Cannery, he sold this big cannery business in 1952, but his assistant who worked for him, a woman who worked for him for a number of years, she stayed on working there at the cannery and working for the new owners of the cannery. And when she finally retired in the 1960s, they gave her the film as a gift, as a retirement gift. And so I collected it when I was at the Maritime Museum from her family, and I used to show it at the Maritime Museum. I had a whole little edited exhibit of it. And then when we dismantled the Monterey Bay Aquarium and I found homes for the collection, I transferred that film to the Monterey Bay Aquarium because, of course, that's the site of the old Hovden Cannery, and they're always looking for artifacts that connected to the Hovden Cannery. So they actually have the color version of the film, which I tried to get, but because of the pandemic, we weren't able to get the right people to get the color version of it, unfortunately. But we do have the black and white version of it, and it's actually only half of the film. The whole film runs about 45 minutes, but a lot of it's repetitive because it shows the different size cans going through the same process. But there's some really remarkable things in the film. For example, at one point you'll see sailors in the film sorting out cans. Of course, the film was shot in 1943. At that time, there was a big demand for workers in these canneries. Sardine was considered to be an essential food product during the war. They needed it for the war effort. And so, because the workers were needed, they would bring in local military to work in canneries from time to time. High school kids were brought in to work in the canneries from time to time. Actually, they considered to be your patriotic duty to work in the cannery during World War II, and then you could volunteer to work in that cannery. So you didn't have to wait for the aquarium to open up to be a volunteer. You could have volunteered at Hovden Cannery during World War II. So it was really a big deal to work there. They also had Italian prisoners of war working in those canneries. There was an Italian prisoner of war camp actually at Fort Ord. And they would either send them into Slimmest Valley to work in the ag fields, or they sent some of them into the canneries here in Monterey. And I met a woman, a Sicilian woman actually, who worked in the canneries at that time, and she met her husband, who was an Italian prisoner of war, who was working in the cannery at that time. And after the war, they were able to hook up again and got married. So also a woman that I know who I interviewed knew quite well, actually, one by the name of Dorothy Wheeler. Dorothy Wheeler was a Monterey woman who went to work at Hovden's Cannery in 1936 and worked in that cannery till 1973. She then went across the bay into Moss Landing after that and worked at the cannery there for a couple of years. So Dorothy actually is in this film, and I interviewed her about that. And she told me, yeah, when they made the film, they all got dressed up, all the women did, and they put on makeup and lipstick and wore dresses and things, which they wouldn't normally do when they're working in the cannery. And unfortunately, because it's not in color, you can't really see it as well, but you can in the color version. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to my partner in crime here, Kim Gudmundson. Kim, I'm going to mispronounce your name, I'm sorry. So I'll let you do that part. I've known Kim for a couple of years, and she said she did her thesis at Stanford University, and it's really a wonderful thesis. So, and she is going to read something from Cannery Row. Go ahead, Kim.
Okay, thank you. Yes, it's Kim Gudmundson. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I opened my thesis with a quote from Steinbeck because it's important to tie things back to what people know, and people know Steinbeck. So first, let me just read a few sentences from the first 2 pages. He said, "In the morning, when the sardine fleet has made a catch, the purse seiners waddle heavily into the bay, blowing their whistles. The deep-laden boats pull in against the coast where the canneries dip their tails into the bay. The cannery whistles scream, and all over town, men and women scramble into their clothing and come running down to the row to go to work. Then shining cars bring the upper classes down, superintendents, accountants, owners, who disappear into offices. Then from the town pour wops and Chinamen and Polacks, men and women, in trousers, in rubber cloths and oil cloth aprons. They come running to clean and cut and pack and cook and can the fish. The canneries rumble and rattle and squeak until the last fish is cleaned and cut and cooked and canned. And then the whistles scream again, and the dripping, smelly, tired wops and Chinamen and Polacks, men and women, straggle out and droop their ways up the hill into town, and Cannery Row becomes itself again, quiet and magical." But beneath Stein, that's the end of the reading. Beneath his elegant prose was a much less magical reality, where the working conditions were very difficult, particularly in the early years, which you won't get to see in this video. As he said, it's 1943, and the industry started in 1900. So there are 40 years of history that get us to this point that was pretty difficult. So let's turn to the film and keep an eye on some of the people that you see, and we'll talk a little bit more about them after. Okay, Tim?
Yeah, go ahead and run the film.
We should say the film is silent, so don't think there's anything wrong with your computer.
But I may throw a few things in every once in a while. There's old Mr. Hovden looking rather nervous. By the time this film was made, there can be up to 100 sardine boats out there. Many of them are coming from Southern California and were Japanese-owned boats.
And it was a remarkable growth from 1905 when the first major canner booth had only 3 boats.
Yeah, it changed a lot. You can see the different, there's stuff, what's called pursaners and some Wampara boats out there. Now this canning vats system, so the nets they were using were made of cotton. They had to be treated with because the salt, the sea from the ocean could destroy the net. So they would treat it in this tannic acid. They'd actually get the bark of a tan oak tree, just boil it, and the tannic acid from the tan oak tree would actually, that's what they treat these nets with. And they had to do this at least once a week to do that with those nets. That net could be very expensive. That net could cost up to $15,000. That's right on the Monterey Wharf, by the way. That's where they are. And the Rappa family, anybody remembers Rappa's restaurant? It was their family that ran that business. And there were 12 guys on the boat. Everybody had something to do. The Sea Maid would have been one of Hovden's boats. But the fishermen would actually contract every year with particular canneries every year, and and you would fish that one cannery the whole season. And this is essentially the same idea, only this type they're actually sort of pouring this goop of this tannic solution onto the net. That's what they're doing there. And it actually sticks to the net and stays there much longer. So they only had to do that like once a month or so. There's Seaside behind you. And they usually went out about 4 o'clock in the afternoon.
And that's because sardines were caught at night because of the shimmer of their luminescence of their scales.
Yeah, the sardines feed on a phosphorescent little krill. Plankton, I guess. Now boats come in, you can see how low that guy's in the water. That guy's got 50 tons of sardine on that boat.
The children of the cannery women, when they were at school, could look down from the schoolyard and see how low the boats were riding in the water, and know if they were low that their parents, their mom, would be busy working late and they could stay longer in the schoolyard and play.
Yeah, you can see he just came in. Look how low that guy is. They're the sardine hoppers. I think I mentioned in another program that the hoppers were introduced in 1926. It was an idea of Newt Hovden's. He didn't necessarily invent it, like that says, but it was his idea. And they're anchored about 500 feet off the cannery, and then they literally and this works with a marine pump and a steel pipe, and they're just sucked into the canneries. About 70 tons an hour they could take. There they go.
They were bringing in thousands of tons a day. It's remarkable.
And depending on the cannery, some of the larger canneries, Hovden's did, they had at least 2 hoppers operating at the same time.
Not all the canneries were the same. Hovden's was the most advanced in many, many ways. When Hovden was automated, others were still doing manual processing of the fish and not having hoppers pulling up close to the canneries. It was a different environment at each cannery and changed over the years. You might recognize that as the building that is now the aquarium.
And that's the administration building for the aquarium today.
Right on the curve.
And the guy in the middle is a guy named Lund, and I don't remember his first name. Don't know who the guy is on the end though. I should have that someplace. There are high mucky mucks in the Hovden Cannery.
I only have his initial, Tim, as A.L. Lund.
Yeah, maybe it's Albert, I think. Albert Lund, that sounds right to me.
Familiar, yeah. The birds certainly knew when the fish came in. So Tim, this is a picture of where it's coming in from the underwater hopper into the
Into the pump house, up to the weight room. So there'll be a holding tank down there in that area as well. And these fish elevators up to the scale house, which actually moves the scales. But you know, when they went through that hopper system, the force was so strong it actually would scale those fish when they went through it. There they go. Soon to be someone's lunch.
A little bit of work to do between now and then.
And this is the weight room. This is how the fishermen got paid. So the boat owners of the boats would negotiate every year with the cannery owners every year for prices per ton of their fish. And to make sure they're getting paid correctly, they would send the crewmen into the weight room as they're unloading and make sure they're not getting cheated. And the fishing game actually had a guy there all the time as well. And the fishing game guy thought they weren't doing something correctly. He had a button that he could push that would stop everything from going. And that's the weighmaster. And it really goes by gravity.
And they're always with water. The water is what's going to keep them fresh through the
But not
process.
salt water, it's actually fresh water. While being pumped from Carmel Valley. Anybody remembers the reservoir up in Pacific Grove, up off David Avenue? That water was all being used to work in those canneries down there.
So you're going to see some cutting machines and women working at them, and after we can talk about what it was like before cutting machines.
Here's it. You notice she's dressed nicely here. Nice hairdo there.
And notice that she's punching slips. We can talk about that later.
And as I think I mentioned in an earlier program, of course, the majority of the labor force were women, and they had the harder of the jobs in these canneries. There they go.
Watch how fast she's working.
Yeah, you got to be fast.
I love this film.
Ooh, there goes the heads and tails. Of course, all that heads and tails and the offal, which you were moving earlier, that stuff all goes into the reduction process. So it's all piecework, right? Paid according to the number of buckets cut. Holding tank at the aquarium or at Hovden Cannery. The holding tanks, if you know the aquarium is about where the bat ray pool is today. And I interviewed a number of folks that worked at Hovden Cannery, and all the men told me that on beautiful sunny days, they all wanted to work in the holding tank area. I wasn't sure what that was all about, so I asked a few more questions. Then they said, kind of slow, they said, well, on beautiful sunny days, all the women, and there weren't a lot of them men, but the few women that went to school, Hopkins Marine Station, on these beautiful sunny days would sunbathe in the nude on the beach down there. So, oh, I see. Tomato sauce. And they got the tomatoes from the Salinas Valley, so they were actually fresh tomatoes. They made their own sauce.
And actually, at one point, Hovden was one of the only canners who actually put his own fields out there and grew his own tomatoes, and he was owning the process from the ground to the can.
That's correct, yeah.
But not everything is packed in tomato sauce either. Some were packing in oils.
Olive oil, the fancy ones got olive oil. Mustard, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
You can see the soldier here. And she's sorting cans, that's what she's doing.
And they're going to go down a belt, and they'll be in front of the women who are going to be doing the packing, so they can reach up and grab a can to pack it. And they move fast too.
I had to do that all day.
Yeah, she's setting them upright so the workers downstairs can grab it as is in the right position.
Again, it's condiments is tomato sauce, really tomato ketchup is what it is, and or mustard oftentimes too.
There's a funny story about a woman who's new on the job, and she cuts her hand and bleeds a little bit into the can and is worried, and someone on the line tells her not to worry, there'll be tomato sauce in there anyway.
There it goes. Mm-mm. That's salt that he's pouring. Only the perfect fish are packed. You see all the ladies on the canning line here.
You can see them reach up and grab an empty can and pack them, and you can see some of them have a paper on their backs.
Which is how they got paid. Kim, you want to explain how that worked?
There were actually different canneries and different periods in the same cannery, different processes. So in some systems, every 12 cans, the woman would turn a can upside down, and then the supervisor would put a mark or a punch on the tag that's on her back. And then when she finished work, that tag was counted, and that's how she was paid, if she was paid piecework.
And this type, and in the late 30s, piecework, these ladies were making about 23 cents for every 16 cans they put up.
Until 1939, or 39, I'm sorry, when the union came in 1936, 37, that was the first year that their wages went up. Before that, it was 25 to 35 cents an hour.
Yeah.
Or, yeah, per can.
And also, prior to World War II, you would never see a man working those canning lines. I mean, the height of the Depression, there weren't enough women to work the lines, they shut them down. Even if there were men out on the street, said, I'll go in there and do that, because that was considered to be women's work.
And we can talk more about that after.
Yeah. You can see all that steam, so everything was run by steam, ran all the machinery, and they go through a two-step process. So these they're going to be pre-cooked first before they put the lids on them. And then they seal them after they've been pre-cooked for about 30 minutes. Now they're putting the lids on.
So now there's men working in the environment because they're no longer actually handling the food. The women were handling the food.
Woohoo. They're coming out what they call exhaust boxes. That's what those things are called, but they're just pre-cookers. And a washer loaded into the retort basket. Notice this is what the men do.
Tim, you have any idea how many cans they could put in one retort basket?
Actually, I don't. A lot, though.
Again, here you see the women have tags on their backs, and you can also see that only a few are sitting, most are standing. Yeah. And the shifts ran anywhere, depending on the year, from like 1 hour to 16 hours. Every fish had to be packed because they had no refrigeration.
Yeah, you didn't go home until you put all that fish up. And the fisherman had a good night, you're going to be there a long time. And I know that some of these women, oftentimes when they finish working in one cannery, they'll go down the street and work in another if the other cannery wasn't complete, didn't finish all the fish.
You can see how easy it is for them to cut their hands. And in this video, they have gloves, but in the early years, nobody had gloves unless they brought them themselves. And those fish are cold and slippery. And there'd be someone else down the line who would check their work.
Yeah, they were called repackers. And they would go with, and actually, if they weren't packed properly, they actually repacked them. Oh, that's it. That's how it is. Okay. Do we want to watch it again? No.
No, how do we? There we go.
So again, that's only about half of what the film, but the rest of it really is just shows different size cans. There is some scenes in the warehouse, show them boxing up, and there's a wonderful scene of them hand wrapping all the cans, which my friend Dorothy Wheeler actually was in that scene, but we don't have that one today.
That was fantastic. It was really fun to watch with both of you. We're going to open this up to question and answer at this point. So if anyone wants to type questions into the chat box, please feel free to do so, or you can unmute yourself and ask questions directly. And we would recommend going into gallery view so you can see everyone's face at this point. So anybody from the group have questions? I see your hand up, Bonnie.
I do. I'm curious, they were showing the tall cans. And I know I've seen the footage of the sardine type cans.
Right.
And was there a different type of fish or something else in the tall cans?
No, same fish.
The tall cans looked like they were tomato sauce. The ovals, the woman at the end was doing the flatter
Right.
ovals.
The oval can.
Yeah,
Right. I'm familiar with those and what it looks like. I thought, though, that they were put in the can and it was canned, then they were cooked, but they were cooked first, then put in the can, then the pressure cooker.
So the process would go, the tall cans, they actually would add the condiments into the can first. Then they put the fish in the can, then they're pre-cooked. And then they put the lids on them and cook them again. That's how the process would go.
So they got cooked twice.
Right, and then the oval-sized cans, it's just the same fish, but they use a different, oftentimes they use oil, other things they would in the oval-sized can, but the same process.
Okay, thank you.
And then they also had the fancy pack ones, which are a little or smaller sardines, but it was really the same fish. But they sold them for a little more money. The prefet.
Great, thanks for your question, Bonnie. Here's one from the chat box from Nancy. How did the mesh buckets open up when the fish were brought into the hopper? It seemed to have a bottom and then opened when no one was touching them. Do you know?
It closes like a woman's purse, and so they had a mechanism on that big long pole. They could pull on that, which opens the bottom of that net and then closes back up again when they need to close it. So it's that kind of weighted, and they pull it.
Very cool. And Kim, as we were watching the film, you mentioned something about the cutting machines, that there was sort of, you could elaborate a little bit more on the history or what the work was like before the cutting machines were in place.
Initially it was all hand done. You know, it was all done by hand, and it took skilled workers to do that initially. And so in the early days of the canneries, the workers that were doing the cutting were mostly Asian workers, Japanese, Chinese. There were also some Hispanic workers also who had skills to do that. And so they always made a little bit more money, but it was a much slower process to do that. So as the demand for sardines grew, then they needed to come up with a faster process, and eventually they came up with these cutting machines and it was all done mechanically.
Yeah, so when Booth, considered the father of sardines, even though he didn't last as long or become as important as Hovden did. He opened in 1900, and in 1905 he only had 3 boats, and he wasn't putting up very many sardines. And he hired in 1910 Pietro Ferrante and Knut Hovden. And Pietro was focused on boats and nets. And his innovation allowed them to go from 3 boats that had 5 to 15 tons each to 12 boats that could grab 300 tons each. So they increased to thousands of tons of fish a day in 1910. And so that required the canneries to be able to process that much. And that's where Knut Hovden came in, and he put in many different innovations that allowed the canneries to also be able to handle that much volume of fish. So for example, 5 of the systems he put in was a mechanical soldering machine, because before that cans were hand soldered, a suction system that Tim described that brought the fish in from the hoppers, machines that automated the cutting and packing, and you saw those were a lot more sophisticated by 1943 than the original cutting machines, or certainly more efficient than the original.
More efficient. Yeah.
And the ovens to steam cook those sardines. Those were just a few of his innovations in 1910. He left in 1915, in November of 1915. And in 1916, he opened his own cannery. He wanted to do a lot more with reduction. And I see one of the chat comments is what happened to the fish that wasn't canned, and it went to reduction. And the product of reduction was used for a variety of purposes. The oil could go for industrial or food use. And then the meal was sometimes used as fertilizer or as animal feed. So
the product was chicken feed.
Chicken feed, yeah.
Chicken feed was big, and that's where they made all their money. The Monterey sardine honestly, at no point in its history was ever a popular fish to eat. People thought it was just too oily. And they really wanted the little sardines that came out of the North Atlantic. That's what they were after. And so the Monterey sardine really made its big money in the reduction process. And Booth was very leery of the whole idea of getting into the reduction process because he was concerned that it was just too darn easy and deplete the fishery too quickly. So he tried to back away from it. That was one of the main reasons that Hovden broke away from Booth, was because he really wanted to go into the reduction business in 1916 because World War I was going on at that time. And so he was able to do all that. Eventually Booth went into the reduction business as well because he had to survive, but yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, the cutting before the machines came along, he was mentioning that there was a huge group of Japanese men who were cutters. There were a small number of women who were involved in the very, very early years of the cannery. But once it began to become mechanized, the population of women grew dramatically from 25%. Let me see, I have the numbers here. From 25% of the population was women in 1914. By 7 years later, 1921, 50% of the employees were women. And by 1932, 75% of them were women. But the cutting, so the women were predominantly then cutters and packers. And the cutting in the beginning was grabbing a fish, chopping off the head, the tail, slitting the belly, and sending it to the packers. And then the packers would grab the fish, stick their finger in, slide the guts out, and then, put it into a can. So it was very cold, dirty, difficult, really difficult work. And the women were sometimes standing in water because when the fish came loading down onto those work tables in the very early days, it wasn't as pretty as in that video. Water, cold water would splash onto those tables and splash up onto them and drip into their boots. And some of the canneries put down what looked a lot like pallets today for the women to stand on so they wouldn't be standing in the water. It was very, very cold.
And I've talked to women who said they stood in a foot of water sometimes.
Yeah, and women had to provide their own attire in the early days, and not all of them could afford boots, so they just suffered through it. There's a wonderful photograph of the workers outside Hovden at one point, and their attire is dramatically different one person to the next, and some of the women have aprons belted to their dresses because they couldn't afford an apron.
Or in the early days, they used to make aprons out of newspapers. And then there was early days too, all the canneries actually had uniforms, that women would wear uniforms, and that proved to not be very practical. So that didn't last that long. And then, and usually you went to J.C. Penney's on Alvarado Street where you bought your gear, like your rubber boots and different kinds of things to work in the cannery.
Marcia asked, when the fish come in, they were alive. When did they actually die? It's when their heads.
Well, those things are dead by the time they get off that boat.
Okay.
Yeah.
And yes, all of the guts and gills, all of that went into reduction.
All went to the reduction process.
The hoppers were an advantage. Lee asked about the advantage of the hoppers because the boats just didn't have to come all the way in. They could unload far more easily out there.
It was much more efficient, much faster. More fish could get unloaded, but the big reason they brought the hoppers in was because when the big sardine boats called purse seiners began to be used, and that was in 1926. Newt Hovden, again, the Hovden Cannery, brought two of them up from Southern California because of a fisherman's strike that was going on. And that was sort of an annual event. The boat owners would go on strike every year for higher prices for their fish. And sometimes those strikes could last for several weeks. And so he brought in these two big purse seiners because they were bigger boats, could take a lot more fish, to try to break that strike. And eventually they all went to those big boats, and they were just too big to get close to the canneries to unload them. And because of the design of Monterey Bay, you couldn't build little docks and stuff like that where boats could pull up to it to unload them. And so they had to come up with that system. And so they came up with the hopper system. And Monterey Bay is the only place in the world where this hopper system was used. It wasn't anywhere else in the world where they used anything like this. There is a sort of a similar system today used in the Alaskan fisheries, but it's a little bit different.
Tim talked a little bit about World War I, and I can just give you an idea of the growth from during the two world wars, because the 3 times that canned sardines became not necessarily popular in terms of being liked, but definitely being eaten in high volume, were the 2 world wars and during the Depression, because it was inexpensive. But by 1918, Monterey had grown to 7 canneries. And then for World War II in 1945, there were 16 continuously operating canneries.
Right.
Now, obviously, there were more total canneries over time than that, because canneries would change hands or close. So the total number of canneries, it's confusing when you start looking at the history, different people saying how many canneries there were. And the higher numbers you see count the ones that were closed, but the highest continually operating, the period of World War II is when the most canneries were open at one time, and that was 16 canneries. The World War I impact, for example, in 1916, Monterey was producing 97,000 cases of sardines. By 1919, they went from 97,000 cans to 798,000 cans.
And there's a reason for that, though. So as I mentioned, sardines were a very popular food item in the United States at the turn of the 20th century. People ate sardines in the United States almost on a daily basis. But the sardines they were eating were these little sardines that came from the North Atlantic, came from Europe. France was the big sardine producer at the turn of the 20th century. But what happens in the world in 1914? World War I, it cuts off all those sardines coming to the United States. And so they heavily switch and begin to fish sardines along the West Coast here, where they're getting those big guys, those pilchards. And that's when those canneries began to grow, because there was a demand for them. They just weren't popular. But once World War I ended in 1918 and the fisheries were able to open up on the Atlantic side of the world, the Monterey sardines began to lose its popularity in the canned product, and they really began to focus on the reduction part of it. Then, of course, during the Depression, the sardines were a cheap food source. So that was another reason. And of course, and during the war years, World War II, they sent them to the troops all over Europe and into the Pacific. In fact, Jacques Pepin, the famous French chef, I read a biography he wrote, and he talked about as a boy, his mother took him and his brother into the countryside of France where they lived, and he said during the war, the United States would parachute cases of sardines into France for the French resistance. And he said, whenever they do that, he and his brother go and grab those sardines. But what Jacques didn't know, those sardines he was getting were coming out of the Monterey canneries.
So Audrey asks, how soon were women able to advocate for their working conditions? And I actually have a very long chapter in my thesis about this if you're interested in women's labor. It was basically 1936, which was at the same time that the AFL and the CIO, which were initially within one organization, one and the same, that they began to rupture, and the contention between the different labor organizations played out in Monterey. It was one of the ground zeros of this horrible union history. It was 1936 that San Pedro had started to organize its workers and sent someone up to work with the Monterey laborers, because Monterey was a far larger sardine port. And if San Pedro couldn't do as well in their union negotiations, if the owners could say, well, we can't compete with Monterey if they're not union, because they're not unionized. So the union figured that out and went up to Monterey and began organizing. And that's really where women had their first voice. And the first union was actually run by women. The body of electors, the employees, selected women to run their union. And they negotiated a phenomenal contract, but the AFL wasn't very happy about that, nor was management. And they pretty much got stamped out 6 to 9 months after they started. And the next contract that came along was within the control of the men who were sympathetic to the male owners of the cannery. So women still benefited from the unionization of the canneries. But the first contract that those women had achieved in the first 6 months of unionization was far better than any contract they ever got again once men took over the union. So, but that was 1936 that it started. Let's see, our species, Phil asks, are species of sardine that were processed in Monterey completely extinct?
No.
Or can small populations still be found somewhere? Tim, go ahead.
They still catch them here in Monterey.
Yeah.
You can go to some of the restaurants on Cannery Row will serve sardine. So the sardine factory actually serves a sardine salad. They actually sell a grilled sardine. There's Monterey sardines. You can go to your local grocery store and buy California sardines, and the good chance those sardines are from Monterey or California. Although here's the funny part is that they'll catch them here, then they'll flash freeze them, and they'll ship them to China. They'll can them in China, then ship them back to California where you can buy them at Safeway for $2.50. It's a cheaper labor source in China. That's why they do it that way. The truth is there's not a lot of money in the sardine business anymore. That's why people just don't eat them like we used to. But yes, you can catch them. They still catch them out there.
So basically in the 1950s, because of the overfishing of World War II, the population of sardines was severely damaged. The ecosystem was severely damaged, and it was getting harder and harder to make any money off sardine fishing and canning. The numbers of tonnage brought in was decreasing every year from 1942 through 1946, and by 1946-7 season and 1947-48 season, the numbers were just pretty devastating. I'm looking for that right now, the tonnage in the last year. The haul of the last 3 years had dropped from hundreds of thousands of tons down to 27,000 tons, 15 tons, and 41 tons. It had fallen off dramatically. And then the fishing of sardines was banned in 1974 until the population of sardines biomass would once again reach 20,000 tons. And that was attained in 1986. So that sardine fishing, the state, approved a small sardine fishery again at that point.
But they had plenty of warnings. They had warnings as early as 1929 from California Department of Fish and Game, telling them that you guys need to cut this fishery down. You're taking too many fish. 1939, Francis Clark, who was a biologist for California Department of Fish and Game, said that you need to cut this fishery in half. And she said in the Monterey Herald's annual sardine edition that year, she wrote that, because she was asked, where are all the large sardines? She said, they're all in the cans. That's what she said, which is something that Ed Ricketts actually says a few years later, but he got it from her. And so they had plenty of warnings about it, but there's also a whole debate about what it was. I mean, there are biologists who were not sure that overfishing really was the major reason. Overfishing certainly plays a role in it, but there were other issues, environmental issues, and water temperature changes in particular. So the water temperature changes really changed in Monterey beginning in the 1940s. They begin to drop to a colder water, and the sardines don't like that cold water, and so there are studies that show that sardines and anchovies will make these massive disappearances every 70 or so years. So there is thought that Monterey was just on a natural cycle, and they just made that massive disappearance because it was that time for them to do that. We think that when they began to heavily fish sardine in 1915, they're already on that declining cycle. And they have made a comeback out there, not in the numbers they were in 1938, where they said you could walk across the bay on their backs, but will they reach those numbers again? Yes, they will reach those numbers again. Maybe not in my lifetime, but they'll get there again someday.
Yeah, that woman he was talking about had set a limit for the entire Pacific Ocean, saying that the biomass could not withstand withdrawal from the entire Pacific Ocean of greater than 250,000 tons.
Right.
And Monterey was pulling that alone. In 1941-42, California pulled in 537 tons of sardines, and Monterey alone was 227,000 tons of that. So yeah, they had plenty of warning for a very, very long time. But follow the money.
That's it. People are making, well, at least the can owners are making lots of money.
I think that's a nice segue to another question that came through in the chat from Bonnie. After the sardine crash, what did the women turn to for work?
I don't know. A lot of them probably retired. They said that they would, well, some went to other fish. So this is sardines we're talking about, and there were other fish. Some retired. They'd been working for, you know, they were in their 50s or 60s. They'd been working their entire adult lives. Tim?
You know, keep in mind that the sardine fishery, it was seasonal work.
Right.
For most of these women. So the sardine season in Monterey went from August 1st to February 15th. And so after February, those women would go home. And so after the fishery collapsed, a lot of them just returned home and were housewives. And
there was also a good portion of the women were migrant workers. And when the sardine season ended in the end of the winter, February, they would go on to the agricultural fields and then come back, which actually made the unionization period rather challenging because you had a very narrow window to try and identify and argue for unionization, get everyone signed up, get an election, get it all done. And in the end, the AFL ended up winning the election in part because a lot of the migrant workers who were supporters of the CIO had already left to the fields. So that is what it is.
I'm wondering if either of you can speak to how working in the cannery compared to working in other factories during that time or working in the agricultural fields. How did this compare to other manual labor at that time?
Kim, you want to handle that one?
Well, agricultural work is not something that I studied at that time, other than to, you know, you bump up against it all the time. That's very backbreaking manual work in very hot climate, though the closer to the water your fields are, you know, maybe a little bit less oppressive, but you can see how hard that work is today if you drive around, you know, the Salinas area. And again, a lot of the workers did go back and forth and do both kinds of terrible labor. The canneries in the early years in particular, they were just really, really difficult working environments. They were cold because, again, it was winter. The environment was very drafty because of the material the buildings were made out of. They couldn't be heated because they needed to preserve the quality of the fish. We already talked about it being wet and them standing in water. You could see on the film it was a very steamy environment. So the women were breathing this air. There was no air filtration. The machines were extraordinarily loud. Women complained about, you know, surprised that they weren't deaf as they got older. And they're working around fast moving belts and moving knives. So it was dangerous work. The hours were long. As I had said, it could be up to, before unionization, it could be up to 16 hours a day. So there are stories of women falling asleep on the line and being waked up by others, or someone just, you know, let her sleep and did her work as well as the other woman's work. So it was a very challenging environment to be in.
Right, and there was no, they didn't have any medical personnel. There's someone to be assigned, somebody would be assigned to be the nurse. Well, they had no medical training, but they would be the nurse in the cannery. And I had a doctor once, I gave a tour of Cannery Row once, and I had a doctor on my tour, and they asked about all that powdered fish bone that's flying to those canneries from the reduction process, which was true. They were running through especially the reduction plants, you're breathing all that stuff in, and it can't be very good for your health. So, and I don't know, I didn't have an answer for that.
Well, they didn't even have nurses for the first many, many years.
Yeah.
If you got injured, you had to take yourself to the doctor, pay the medical bill, and miss your wages while you were gone. And it was with unionization that they required nurses, and then they had a single day's training class. And it would just be a woman who was working on the line who took a day to take the class and then would still be working on the line. But if someone got hurt, she would be called to come clean it up and put a Band-Aid on and recommend whether the person went to a doctor or not. And there were complaints or violations made against the unions when canneries were in violation of that. And the contracts at some point actually began to specify that the woman couldn't be canning if she was a nurse because she wouldn't be clean enough to do the work that she was assigned to do. So at some point, the nurses actually became a full job. Let me see, what else do I have?
I'm wondering too, Tim, you mentioned that the holding tanks that were in the that can now be seen in the aquarium. What are some other relics that somebody's walking through Cannery Row that somebody could look out for that would be kind of interesting to note from this cannery?
I think the best place to go is behind the Clement Hotel. There's that walkway that goes around on the water side there, and you can from there you can still see one of their old holding tanks there, and you can see a number of the platforms that was built for that held the cannery. So there's still a lot of stuff is still there, what we call the historic footprint to the cannery. So it's all still there. And of course, on Cannery Row, there's the workers' cabins that are up behind across from where Ed Ricketts' lab is. One time there were 60 of those cabins that stretched from Cannery Row down to the Monterey Wharf, and mostly men in those cabins, sometimes 4 or 5 at a time, those little houses there. But there are 3 of them there now that are maintained by the city of Monterey. So they're kind of fun to look at.
Also in the, let me just add to that, in the Monterey Aquarium, one of the things that I got personally very excited about was the whistle. So as you walk into the lobby, if you go straight toward the back wall and take a right, along the back of the boiler side, there's a place you can grab and pull the whistle. So the whistles were really, really critical in the early days of the cannery because nobody had a telephone. And you didn't go to work at 8 in the morning and leave at 5. You only worked when there were fish. And so you had to be called to work. And so each cannery had a unique whistle sound and pattern, and each job also had a unique pattern. And so you had to listen for the whistle to know whether your cannery was calling your job. And so it's really fun to go in there and play with the whistle and do, like 1 long, 2 short.
Go ahead. People began to get telephones. They had phone trees and call people. In those days, your phone number didn't move with you. It was assigned to a house. And I interviewed a woman who came to Monterey in 1938. She was a school teacher, and she rented a little house not too far from Cannery Row. And every morning, about 4 or 5 o'clock, she'd get this phone call. She'd pick up the phone. All she'd hear on the other end is, fish. Well, she thought it was her students playing a trick on her. Well, it turns out, of course, the folks that lived in the house before she did were cannery workers, and there was a cannery calling to come down the hill to go to work, the boat to come in.
Mm-hmm.
Some women said they slept with their windows open at night all winter long so they could hear the cannery blow its whistle in the morning. Cutters were called first, but once that cutter call came, if you were a packer, you knew you were next. So you had a little more time to get out of bed, get dressed. And by the way, if you were a mom, you also had to figure out what you were going to do with those kids who had to be fed, dressed, and some days of the week sent out to school. And there was no daycare at that time. When unions came in, that's when they began to talk about daycare and eventually set one up. But before that, it was a struggle. And some women brought their kids to work if they owned a car and left the child in the car outside the cannery. So even a nursing woman who might run down and nurse her baby on a 10-minute break she had. I mean, the conditions were unthinkable today.
Yeah. To add to what Kim is saying about the whistle at the aquarium, the whole exhibit that they have on the cannery is really marvelous if anyone hasn't seen it, because they've got the boiler there, the whistle, they show the hoppers, or not the hoppers, but the packing, the way they pack them, and they've got video and such. So it's really well done.
It's fun.
Yeah, it is.
That's fantastic. Any other questions or comments from the participants? You can feel free to unmute yourself or type into the chat.
Yes, I have a question. I wondered how much fishing today is done by big nets, and how is that controlled? I mean, I would think it would just be decimating the oceans, and we know that that's happening, but I don't know how that's controlled, if anybody has that answer. And the other question I had for someone who does actually use a pressure cooker and had to clean pea soup off a ceiling when my mother used to use a pressure cooker, did any of the cans explode when they were in the pressure cooker?
I get
You sound
No,
like
I don't-
Kim.
I'm not aware of anything exploding, and they kept them cooked at a pretty low pressure, so I'm not aware of that happening. As terms as fishing today, of course, they do fish today with per se nets. They're not the same size as what they're fishing in those sardine days. They are heavily regulated in California by the California Department of Fish and Game. Limits are set every year how many fish they can take, depending on what the species is. The sardine one changes. I think they haven't fished sardines in California, I think the last couple of years, but they were fishing in Mexico just like last year, catching huge numbers, like numbers up of what they were doing in Monterey in the 1930s. And so, but they do control it pretty heavily today.
Yeah, the state fish and game has been involved from nearly the beginning, not from 1900, but from nearly then. And during the war, however, World War II, I don't know for sure about World War I, but I know during World War II, the federal government took over. And there was a lot of, there were a lot of problems during World War II, because on one hand, you had the government coming in and taking boats. So the war was on two coasts for us. We had the Japanese on the Pacific Ocean side, and obviously the war on the Atlantic as well. So the Monterey had the largest fishing fleet, and the Navy came in and took a lot of boats. And then also the military came in, and the draft was started in World War II and took a lot of men. And a lot of people signed up, particularly people who were immigrants who were concerned about how they were viewed by the community and the government, because they came from countries that we were now at war with. And so now you've got this huge demand. The government wants to buy the entire catch of sardines for military use, but you've taken away huge numbers of boats and men. And so it was quite a struggle, and you can go look at some of the, I'm trying to think the name of the archive up at San Francisco. You can pull records that show how closely the federal government was monitoring everything. They have huge spreadsheets that take up a half a table that come in every week from every cannery to the person managing that port that then went on to the federal government. And then they have sheets for every boat that came in, and they measured and weighed and counted everything. They have the hours that how many women worked how many hours every day, Monday through Friday at every cannery. I mean, it's just the amount of data they collected was amazing. And one of the amazing things for the United States from that is that the food industry, after World War II, the food industry in the United States really capitalized on some of the processes that were invented in Monterey to measure and count sardine production, in using those tools then for the rest of the food industry as that developed in the United States for the next half century.
And to give you an idea of how much control they had, so the boat owners, they couldn't negotiate during World War II with canneries. The government told them where they're going to unload their fish. And so when the boat would come in every night, they didn't know what cannery they'd be unloading their fish at. And so there'd be a guy from the federal government, the War Production Board. He had a little booth at the end of the breakwater in Monterey. The boat would come in, and then he would tell that boat where to take his fish, to where to unload it. And there was oftentimes they send them all the way up to San Francisco to unload their fish. So they've been fishing all night in Monterey Bay or a little further south, and then have to turn around and go all the way up to San Francisco, which is going to take hours to get up there to unload all their fish. That was pretty common.
Yeah, and they controlled the price of everything, the wages. The government controlled every detail of this, so that there were many, many decades of seasons starting anywhere from a day to weeks late because of negotiations between fishermen, boat owners, cannery operators. And once World War II started and the government figured out that that delay was a problem, they took over that as well, and they just set the price. That was it. That was the wage, that was the price, that was what was going to happen, and it just happened.
Thanks so much. Any other questions from the participants? Or Tim or Kim, if you've got anything to add, any topics we haven't covered yet, you shared a great wealth of information.
Yeah, I just want to say, I don't think we kind of mentioned it without really getting into it, and that is that these are immigrants. This was an extraordinarily diverse workforce. You know, a lot of people think back to what the early years of the United States were, and it was a pretty diverse place here. More diverse even than San Francisco, because I did check those numbers, very close, but more diverse. So you had people of multiple languages from multiple origins standing next to each other, working cooperatively toward, you know, this production goal. And that was true on the boats as well. And that also that these were often family members working across different strains of the industry. So the people who came in to work in the canneries might be the wives, daughters, mothers, cousins, whatever, of the person who owned the cannery or who owned the boat or who or who worked on a boat. And the cannery owners sometimes owned the boat, sometimes didn't. And there was a cooperative of boat owners who actually opened their own cannery. And then, you know, the women were working in that cannery. So there was no really clean line like you might see today or even then in other industries that said, okay, this is management. And, you know, this is the employees. This is a separate group of people who do this function over here, owning boats and fishing, and they don't have anything to do with these other people. No, it was a family affair. Monterey sardine industry was massively a family affair, which made it very difficult when you had to get into those tough negotiations all the way along.
Yeah, thank you. Good. Excellent.
Tim, anything to add?
No, I think that was good.
I would also love if you guys read my thesis.
Yeah, I'm definitely interested to read that. Yeah, just as a reminder, again, 2 copies, is that right, at the Monterey Public Library?
2 copies in circulation and 1 in the history room when it reopens.
That's wonderful. Well, thank you so much to both of you for sharing such a wealth of knowledge. This was really, really fascinating, and I know that the participants enjoyed it. Thank you to you all for the questions as well, for the participation. I'm seeing some claps going around. I'm going to just share a quick reminder about next week. So on November 5th at 2 p.m., we'll be here with David Ward, the writer and director of the 1982 film Cannery Row. He'll be interviewed by Jan Price about the making of the film. Please watch the film before the discussion and bring questions. You can check out a DVD from the Monterey Public Library, or you can rent it on YouTube or Amazon Prime for about $1.99. So we hope that you'll all join us next week for that discussion. For the November 7th big event, we're putting together quite a program for you all, so I hope you'll join us for that as well. Tim and Kim, thank you so much again for your participation today. Thank you to the Monterey Public Library for hosting this wonderful event, and we'll see you all next week.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Kim.
Thank you, Tim. Wonderful working with you.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that.